Let's get to our first question is from Amy Charles on YouTube. What do you think about doing this with an IPL? Let's say I fermented at 50 to 52 degrees using Imperial's L13 Global. I love that strain. I pull it off yeast and transfer it to a secondary and dry hop it. Drop it even further below that fermentation temperature, question mark, like maybe 40 degrees, or is that too cold? So there's a few different factors going on here, and note, and I am gonna make this caveat here. Amy is saying that, I believe that's Amy. Amy is saying that she is making an IPL, so we are not talking about a cold IPA right here. We're talking about an IPL. Some of the primary differences is an IPL doesn't necessarily use a high percentage of adjunct grains. It is typically fermented cooler. A lot of times cold IPA will be lager yeast fermented at warmer temperatures, or ale yeast fermented at cooler temperatures. So let's check this out. Kind of one of the reasons when people are talking about what to do with dry hop in a scenario like this, a lot of times people like to try to get the yeast out of solution. Sometimes people are doing post-fermentation dry hops. And when you want to do that, potentially you want to drop that temperature down a little bit, because it helps you get some of that yeast out of suspension. It can by doing that, you can potentially mitigate some of the risk of hop creep. So a lot of times people want to get that yeast off of there. And so on some level, this is a little bit of a flocculation question. And I've had this question myself too, because on the pro side, or even the home side, depending on what your equipment is like, I want to be able to harvest yeast off of a batch that I'm dry hopping, right? Because I want to keep that strain going, so I don't have to continue to buy more yeast. I can save money, reap the benefits of quality yeast yields, yeast health, things like that. So on some level, we're talking about flocculation with a question like this. So when fermenting a lager in the 50s, how far down do you have to drop it to kind of get that starting to drop? So I went ahead and I looked at some great information on the Y Yeast website. And we're going to talk about two factors here when it comes to flocculation, especially with lagers. So first of all, they say temperature. Optimum flocculation temperature can vary between strains. And when you think about it, that kind of makes sense. There's enough variation between different strains that would make sense. Research trials of lager strains have shown flocculation to be optimal at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees C, and significantly decreased below 41 F. Flocculation for one lager strain increased when temperature was raised from 41 F up to 77 F. In other research trials, flocculation was repressed at 77 and optimal at 41. By lowering the fermentation temperature, the CO2 production by the yeast is diminished, causing less turbulence and will promote sedimentation. Good record keeping will help to determine the optimum temperature range. So there's a little bit of a it depends type answer, but it looks like it's something you can play around with. I would try crashing that beer down to around 41 and seeing how that does, seeing if that helps to drop that yeast out for you so you can harvest and then dry hop from there. I wouldn't have an issue dry hopping at 41. I do know Scott Janish is talking about dry hopping at 38 and potentially even below, again, Fahrenheit. He does also vigorously rouse those fermenters with high volume CO2 gauges that he will blast CO2 through the bottom of those tanks. So he does a vigorous rouse as well. But let's also look at pH as a factor. Flocculation is influenced by the wort pH. Flocculation can occur in a broad range of 2.5 to 9.0. Optimum range is 3.5 to 4.8 and will vary by strain. Brewing strains of the, I'm not going to jump into that. It's talking about a specific strain or variant that they have. As far as this goes, I mean, it says optimum range is between 3.5 and 4.8. Quite frankly, I think most of the things that you're making are going to be in that range anyways. And even for food safety, you're going to want to see that probably. I believe the food safety line is around 4.5. Don't quote me on that. You can Google it if you need to officially write it in on a test or something like that. But that's really what you're going to be looking at. So, and beer yeast is going to get you there more times than not, as long as your pH starting points aren't all jacked up coming out of the mash or coming out of the kettle. All right. So kind of keeping those two things in mind, looking at maybe testing around 41 for dropping that for an IPL type beer. You want to get that lager yeast to flock out before you dry hop. And then just kind of, it doesn't seem like pH, especially in what you're going to be typically doing with lager beers. There's probably going to be typically right in the 4.5 range for those lagers. But it is pH is still something to keep an eye on. But I would recommend looking at dropping that down to 41, getting that yeast harvest off, and then dumping what is left of the yeast / trub, and then hitting that thing up with the dry hop. And I would consider rousing that fermenter. If you're doing this at home and you have a small enough fermenter that you can rouse that fermenter by hand, that's great. You know, back if you're using a bucket or a carboy, you can slosh it around, whatever. That's cool. People are fermenting in corny kegs, which is awesome. You can toss that upside down for a second. You know, all those good things. But yeah, that would be my recommendation on how to flock out lager yeast prior to a dry hop when making IPL. All right, everybody, thank you so much for watching. If you feel as if you got any value out of the video, please like and subscribe. There are also other videos that you can watch. They're gonna maybe be over here or over here. Appreciate you watching.